Today, we're going to dive into the French defense from the perspective of three separate chess masters, starting off with FIDE master Sahib Singh. Then we move on to Matthew Sadler, a grandmaster and one of the best French defense players of all time. And we will finish it off with one of the best chess players of all time, Frank Marshall. And that particular game is very special. It's also known as the gold coin game and has one of the most electric finishes of all time. So what exactly is the French defense? Well, usually it is e4 or d4, and we play e6. The idea is simple. Our opponent now controls the center with e4 and d4, and we're going to push d5. This gives our opponent a couple of options, right? Pawn takes, the exchange variation, the advanced variation e5, also the normal variation knight c3, and we might even see the Tarrasch variation, knight to d2. And essentially, you either take, you push, or you defend. In this case, we get the normal variation from Sahib Singh's opponent, Jake Darminian. And okay, we go ahead and pin. We're undermining the defense of this pawn. Okay, so knight to e2, and we take. So before being able to take back, you have to alleviate the pin. So a3. Now you can take the knight, but knight just takes back. And if you move back, probably something like b4, trying to get rid of the bishop entirely. And Sahib Singh feels as though bishop e7 is a more accurate move. So, okay, the knight takes, and we play knight to d7. I feel as though the idea was simple. Looking to push c5, knight takes back, then bishop takes, attacking the king's side with that dark squared bishop. So the opponent goes ahead and plays d5, and we just go ahead and move the knight out of the way. This doesn't just add one extra attacker, but it adds a second attacker, the queen, knight, and also a third attacker, the pawn. So first, knight takes back. Now we're once again triple attacking the pawn. Pawn takes. And while maybe tempting for the FIDE master to go ahead and take this e6 pawn, it's not the best move. Not right away. First, you want to trade queens. And the point is, after king takes queen back, bishop takes, you're going to have a lot of tempo. We get more of a passive f3 move and the long castle. Very classy because it comes with discovered check on the king, d1. The king will have to move over. And you can see that after rook to e8, we have a very dominant position. Our bishops, our knights are out. The rooks are in the center of the board, and both have open files. On top of that, while before you would notice that white had a massive center advantage, now the center is completely cleared and the rooks own the center. So by being patient and using that timely push to our advantage, we've taken over this game, right? And of course, our opponent's development is awful. He has no development at all. The rooks are at home. The bishops are at home. It's a dream position for black here. So bishop to e3. Now, instinct might be to defend the a7 pawn, but actually just bishop to f5, targeting the own pawn here on c2. If bishop takes, you will have trouble here after b6. The bishop's trapped. If the knight wasn't here, you could have some tricky idea of bishop check. King moves over, and then maybe rook check. But white does not have quite enough development. And either way, the bishop's blocked, so none of that is possible. And of course, Jake Dominion does not take that pawn. He instead moves the king out of the way. He is no doubt looking to connect the rooks and probably kettle this bishop, or if not, get the bishop on b5. So knight to d5, attacking that bishop, and then maybe looking for bishop c5, which is a continuous idea in the French defense, is getting the bishop on c5 to attack the king's side, along with a pawn storm. So we'll see how that transpires, but for now, bishop to d4, g7 is now hanging. He probably wasn't too quick to take the g pawn, instead trying to push c4 and getting rid of this knight here. So we just move out of the way, instigating a trade. It's a trade because, yes, we can't win the knight back, but the knight was protecting the bishop, and now we could actually win that bishop right away. So as you can see, we're attacking the knight as well. And trading isn't necessarily what we want to do, but if we can get a really nice attack with tempo, Sahib Singh will do that. Because we have initiative, we do want to try to actually attack the king, who is trapped in a really vulnerable part of the board, with the bishops roaming free. And after knight to d5, he finally plays bishop c5. Now, If you play the French defense after breaking over the center, bishop c5 is oftentimes a very good idea. And you can see that simply just rook takes knight would be one of many ideas. It's a discovered check on the king, and you wouldn't be able to take the rook back. You'd have to move the king. So the king goes to g3. And this is actually the beginning of the end. Believe it or not, despite being completely even, this is -7 for black. It starts off here with bishop d6. An excellent move of basically forcing the F pawn to push down. Notice that there is a double attack on the pawn, but there are two defenders. The best way to get rid of a defender is simply to kick it, c6. And at this point, you might want to resign because after the knight moves out of the way, we have rook f4 threatening a discovery. But it's pretty devastating. The king is actually completely stuck. Look at this jail the king is in. In other words, no matter what our opponent plays, we will be able to discover check him. You cannot stop it. It's an inevitable discover check. We're up a pawn, but we're about to be up a whole lot more. So simply just c5. Now, if we discover check the king, at the very least, we'll win back the bishop, but he misses a very simple tactic here. Notice rook e3. And even at the FIDE master level, when you put enough pressure on your opponents, you can get a very cheap double rook laddered mate. Notice that there are no squares to the king, and this is just game over. Game number 2, Matthew Sadler. I am really excited for this one because he's actually considered one of the best French defense players of all time. Same idea, guys. We're pushing the center, but here we see the Tarrasch variation, which is one of the more rare lines, which is why it's so exciting to play. But the idea is the same. He's just adding extra protection to e4. If we did take, the knight just takes back. The same thing would occur if he was on c3, but the pin isn't possible anymore because eventually you'll play c3 and probably create kind of like a trap on the dark square diagonal where you won't be able to move this dark squared bishop. So h6, many people might not see the value in playing a move like h6. To me, I think it's quite clever for a young grandmaster to wait and see what are you going to do? Because are you going to take? Are you going to open up my bishops? Are you going to try to castle long, short? What kind of game are you going to play? By playing h6, we get a better idea of what our opponent is looking to do. So chalk it up to just a high-class waiting move and knight to f3. Basically saying we're going to put a lot of pressure on e5. And I believe that the main idea here is to push e5 and to basically limit the mobility of Matthew Sadler's pieces. So knight to f6, the pawn does push down. It's not really an advanced variation. It's more of a delayed advance because it didn't happen right away. The knight moves over to d7. And once again, there's a lot of pressure on the c5 square. And you will see this as a big theme in the French, trying to go for this c5 push. Can we get it? Will our opponent allow it? Is he going to play something like b4? Well, that might not work because bishop's defending, so perhaps a3. In this case, c3, which essentially would do the same thing. But here, we just go ahead and push c5 first. We're not allowing b4. And in this situation, if you take, you do allow this bishop to end up on a really nice square. And as we saw in the last game, there are some really nice attacks that can be instigated from this situation. So what does the Grandmaster do here to defend? Well, bishop to d3. This is actually the best move. At first, I wasn't too sure why you were doing this because, in my opinion, by playing h6, you're not necessarily looking to castle short or long. You're more just waiting to see what your opponent's going to do. But there's a very strong possibility that black may castle long, is what I'm thinking when I see h6. So by putting the bishop on d3, attacking h7, you're really hoping your opponent's going to castle short. And as you'll see later on, that might not work out in the favor of our opponents. So knight to c6, adding extra pressure on d4, and we get the castle. And to me, this is where the game really starts. This is officially the middle game because Matthew Sadler has an idea and g5. Now, some basic premises here, right? The bishop's going to try to get the c5, and we're going to pawn storm, eventually dislocate this knight. Probably try to get the rook onto the G file. And then you'll probably see a queenside castle and maybe bishop B7 looking to kettle. At this point, after G5, we know that Sadler's not going to castle short. So just for recognition purposes, you should be ready for a long castle. His opponent was not ready for this, and things get really crazy very quickly. Bishop B1, passive idea, probably looking to put the queen on C2 and maybe attack the king side, but B6, preparing that bishop. The queen's coming out, and we're going to see a castle. C4, adding extra pressure in the center of the board. And here comes G4. The attack has begun. Now, many players would look to castle long first, but Sadler felt as though this was the correct moment to strike. Just due to the fact that there's no really good for the knight to go. The knight would basically have to retreat back to E1, which also takes away a square from the rook and queen, who would much prefer to be eyeing down that E5 pawn. So instead, pawn takes. If pawn takes here, now you can just take back, and then pawn takes here, and it actually ends up pretty good for white. So pawn takes, once again, pushing E6. We go ahead and take, and now you have to defend this knight, but you've cleared up space for E5 now. Knight takes, pawn takes, but not knight takes back. Now at first I thought knight takes pawn is actually a great move. I thought, okay, now you're up 2 pawns, and we're going to put the queen on H4, maybe rook on G8, and we're just going to completely decimate our opponent. But it turns out that F4 is a solid idea here. If you play en passant, you end up in a position with a queen rook battering ram. If I could play that out for you. So takes, knight takes, queen takes, and all of a sudden, yeah, we're up 2 pawns, but you have to defend F7, and this might not be the best way to go about it. In turn, if you just move the knight out of the way, just let's say C6, the queen can now take right here on G4. And sure, we can get the rook on G8 eventually, but Sadler was very keen on keeping that pawn. It was a big advantageous pawn. So instead, he wants to defend the G4 pawn. He does that with rook to G8. He says, I'll take this pawn here on E5 later. It won't be possible to defend. So bishop to H7, rook just moves over. Nothing really to think about there. The bishop comes back. To me, he's going to look to try to win this H6 pawn, and he want to dislodge the rook to do it. But queen to C7, adding another attacker to E5, which our opponent has not even began to defend. So, okay, rook to E1. And you still don't necessarily want to take this E5 pawn. It's a little too risky. Plus, the king isn't going to castle just yet. You still have about 2 moves for that. So instead, bishop to B7. He's not rushing anything. The knight reroute here, what I would be watching out for right away is something like maybe knight G3, maybe, just trying to block the G file. And more importantly, watch out for the discoveries. Bishop H6 would actually force a trade of bishops and lose us a pawn. So simply just rook moves back, bishop defends. And here, if the bishop comes back, the queen can just take now on H7, and the bishop's lost. So knight to G3, like we predicted, he's trying to alleviate pressure on the G file. So the best way to defend is to add another attacker, saying, okay, you're going to try to get out of this. Well, I'm just going to add more and more pressure. At some point, D4 will be played, and we're just going to push this H pawn to the promised land. Bishop to E3, we go ahead and castle, and queen to B1. A move that seems very passive, but the idea is to push B4 and create a queenside attack. At this point, Sadler is extremely ahead, only up a pawn, but his development on the queen side, he's turned the queen side into an absolute war zone, while the opponent has done nothing on the queen side. So H5, we get the knight to E2. He's not trying to get H4 followed by H3, so he moves the knight out of the way preemptively. We go ahead and play knight to E5, and the push, the B4 push. So you have to ask yourself here, do we need to take right away? Because we technically can, or are we ready to finish this game off and hit the king hard? Well, if you're a grandmaster of Matthew Sadler's caliber, you are looking to win the game on the spot. And he does that with first d4. Clever little counter to bishop to f4, attacking the knight. If you do move the knight now, you can take here on c5. Now, Matthew Sadler, he does move the knight, but it's not what you think. Knight to f3. So, of course, if you move the king either to f1 or h1, the rook's lost. You just lost an exchange, and you're going to end up losing the game, right? But, of course, if you take with the pawn, pawn takes back. It's a discovery check. Now, the knight isn't necessarily lost right away, but the bishop is. You can move the knight to g3 and lose the bishop here. But you're going to have to find a way to stop h4. This position is completely losing. You'll either get mated or lose the knight here. And that is why Matthew Sadler is an absolute gem. Now, before we get into Frank Marshall's masterpiece, also known as the gold coin game, if you're enjoying this video and you want more, go ahead and leave a comment. Ask any chess question that you want. I will pick the top 5 best questions from any video from now to the end of November. And at the start of December, I'm going to post a video answering those questions and shouting out the person who actually asked the question. Other than that, leave a like if you like the video. Let's get into it. Now, this is a doozy. I'm really excited for this because after d5, we actually see the Marshall defense, which, believe it or not, is named after Frank Marshall. Pushing c5 early on with the idea of playing bishop takes back anyway. So there's a lot of pressure in the center. These are 2 of the top players of all time. His opponent is Stefan Levitsky, who's also a grandmaster and somebody who's contending for world titles at this point, which should tell you the level of his opponent and how this game ends versus how it actually transpires. Knight to c6, and it really is just a battlefield. Who's going to take? What's going to happen here? Pawn takes back, and bishop to e2. White will castle first, but we're okay with that. We're just going to keep our development going. And after bishop to e7, we're not too far behind castling ourselves. And that is what we will do here because our knight is already defended, not once, but actually twice. So even if bishop takes back, and we're completely fine. Of course, in this situation, you would like to see the bishop on c5, pinning this pawn. But for now, bishop to e6 first. This pawn is undefendable. Like, you can't play b4 because knight just takes. But this pawn here is very difficult to defend. If bishop takes back, there's 2 attackers now, but 1 defender, and this pawn will fall. So bishop to e6 first, trying to maintain some semblance of the center. And notice, guys, once again, theme of the video, despite the fact that e4 and d4 were played, we still end up with the only center pawn. The only pawn in the center of the board is black. Be patient, make that push when it counts, and you will control the center anyway. Okay, continuing along, knight to d4. We played bishop to c5. Now is the time to strike, double attack on the knight. So knight takes bishop, actually. Pawn takes back. And what this does is it creates an e6 backwards pawn. This is a high-level maneuver by Stefan Levitsky. And of course, you could probably guess what's coming next, bishop to g4. Of course, the knight can't take the bishop because of this pin. And even if he could, queen would just take back, and the rook's going to come to e1. There's going to be a lot of pressure on the backwards e6 pawn. And Stefan Levitsky was no doubt looking for an endgame, and that is not Frank Marshall's style. He is an attacker, so he gets his queen out to d6. It's a pretty interesting move because it's a much more active square for the queen, but it also defends e6. It adds at least 1 defender to the mix. The bishop is going to move back because now the knight could take the bishop, and that would take away a crucial attacker of the e6 pawn on the light square diagonal. So rook to e6. And notice, at some point, you might have an idea like knight to e4, and there's a triple attack on f2. So you do have to be very careful if you're Stefan Levitsky. However, you're probably happy with the position. If all the pieces were off the board, you would feel as though Stefan Levitsky would have a slight advantage just due to the backwards pawns. But queen to d2, no doubt looking to maybe double up, get the rook behind it, or even sacrifice some pieces to break up the center and win a minor piece back. So we pin the knight, and then bishop takes, rook takes, right? And you'll see that now the whole point of putting the queen here on d2 is going rook d1. We get extra pressure, right here. And this position is getting very tricky to play. So if we're going to take a second to analyze this position, we can quickly notice that we have a pin on the queen, and we are trying to take a little bit of an advantage of our own, maybe double up the rooks and attack f2. But first, queen to c5, trying to double up these pawns. Stefan Levitsky allows this to take place. Bishop takes, pawn takes, queen takes c3, but here comes rook d5. This is a high-level grandmaster world-level play. If the pawn takes, queen takes on e8, and you've lost the game. Actually, rook to f8, notice bishop to e6, and this is checkmate, game over. So you cannot take that rook. That is fine. Knight to d4. If rook takes, we just win the exchange. So you have to move the queen out of the way. Now, believe it or not, queen a5 looks like an amazing move. Couple of things. He's attacking the rook. He's also defending himself from the knight attack. However, this is the decisive losing idea. First, rook to f8, which is what he was going to play anyway to add extra pressure on f2. Next, our opponent plays e5, noticing that the pin no longer exists, so that rook was actually hanging on d5. Okay, rook to h6, attacking the queen, but it's doing much more than that. We're also attacking the bishop. After the queen moves out of the way, rook takes, brilliant sacrifice on h3. What is going on here? Well, if the pawn takes, we have a royal fork, and it's pretty much just game over. You cannot take the rook. You can, however, pressure the queen, but this is actually another mistake. Believe it or not, rook h3 is not the brilliant move that we're going to go over today. The move that made history and made this game famous forced the audience to throw gold coins at Frank Marshall because they were absolutely in awe with this alien level move. Queen g3. Queen g3. Guys, he played queen g3. What is going on? Okay, so for starters, well, let's just point out the obvious here. There are 3 different ways to take this queen. Pawn, pawn, queen. What if I told you that every single way you take this queen is losing? Well, okay, I'll prove it to you. Pawn takes. Knight check, king moves over, back rank, checkmate, game over. Okay, that's just one take though. What if just this, right? What now? Well, notice that h2, h1 covered, checkmate. He has nowhere to go. Game over. Game over. That's it. Okay. So neither pawn takes work. But what about queen takes g3? This is actually the best possible response is queen h3. It's still losing. So knight check e2. The king moves over. Knight takes. Check. Fork. And of course, you can't take with the h2 pawn because it's a discovery. And if you take with the f pawn, it's checkmate. Game over. That's it. Goodbye. So you actually just have to move back. So knight takes, pawn takes, and then the knight comes to d2. And we're just up a full knight, and it's game over. Absolutely incredible. But listen, if you want to get good at the French defense, you don't need to memorize these games. Just take the principles. Don't attack the center right away. Attack with precision later on. Take your time, and then break apart your opponent's center. Look for that c5 push. Develop kingside attacks. And most importantly, don't be afraid to sacrifice your queen. If you want to master the Italian game and the King's Gambit, I got those videos right here for you, so check them out. Stay classy, my friends. Until next time.